The coffee was perfect. It was always perfect. 212 degrees when the water hit the ground, steeped for exactly 4 minutes in the French press, poured through a fine mesh strainer to catch the sediment Harold despised, then finished with a thin ribbon of heavy cream that turned the liquid from black to the color of old mahogany. No sugar, never sugar. Served in the white porcelain cup with the navy blue rim that he had used every single morning since 1987, when the original cup from their wedding china set had finally cracked, and Eleanor had spent 3 weeks tracking down an identical replacement from a discontinued line. 14,600 mornings. That was how many cups of coffee Eleanor Ann Whitfield had made for her husband. She had never counted them before this particular Tuesday in March, but standing in the kitchen at 6:58 in the morning, watching steam curl upward from the navy-rimmed cup, the number arrived in her mind fully formed, as though her subconscious had been keeping a tally all along. 14,600 mornings of performing this single small act of devotion so consistently and for so long that it had ceased to feel like devotion and had become instead something closer to gravity, an invisible force that held her in orbit around another person's life. She carried the cup upstairs on the silver tray, her slippers silent on the carpeted steps, and pushed open the bedroom door with her hip the way she always did. The master bedroom was filled with the pale gray light of early spring, the kind of light that made everything look like a watercolor painting not quite finished. Through the sheer curtains, she could see her garden below the rose bushes, still skeletal from winter, the perennial beds just beginning to show the first brave green shoots of the season. She had planted every single thing in that garden. Every root, every bulb, every carefully chosen specimen arranged according to bloom time and color and height, so that something was always flowering from March through November. It was the only space in 40 years that had felt entirely and completely hers. The only place where her choices were the ones that mattered, where her vision was the one that determined what grew and what did not, where the results of her labor were visible and beautiful and undeniably the product of her own hands. Harold lay on his back with the covers pulled to his chest, his head tilted slightly to the left, his sleeping position. She had memorized it the way astronomers memorize constellations, not because they chose to, but because after enough nights of looking upward, the patterns simply become part of you. His face in sleep was softer than his face awake. The sharp intelligence that animated his features during waking hours relaxed into something gentler, something that reminded Eleanor of the man she had married in 1984, before 4 decades of distance had built walls between them that she could feel but never quite see. She set the tray on the nightstand and touched his shoulder. "Harold, coffee is ready." The same word she had spoken 14,600 times before. But this time his shoulder did not move beneath her fingers. This time the warmth she expected was absent. She touched him again, wrapping her fingers around his hand, and found it cold and stiff, in a way that living hands never are, not even in the deepest sleep. Eleanor stood there holding the coffee cup, steam still rising from it, her husband of 40 years lying motionless beside her, and in that terrible crystalline moment of understanding, she felt something she would spend weeks refusing to examine. Beneath the shock, beneath the horror, there was something else. Something that felt like the first full breath she had taken in decades. Something that felt, God help her, like relief. She pushed the feeling away. She set the cup down. She called 911. And then she sat in the armchair by the window, the chair where she read her books while Harold slept, and she waited. The paramedics arrived in 11 minutes. The doctor confirmed what she already knew. Massive myocardial infarction. Instantaneous. No suffering. Harold Whitfield had died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 85, 3 months before his birthday. He had simply stopped. Like a clock whose mechanism had finally worn through after running precisely and reliably for decades, he had ticked his last tick and fallen silent. The coffee on the nightstand grew cold. Nobody drank it. For the first time in 14,600 mornings, the ritual was broken. She had been 28 when she married him. That was 1984, the year everything changed, though she would not understand how completely until 4 decades later. Eleanor Ann Porter, as she was, then worked as a secretary at the law firm of Hartwell and Whitfield in downtown Boston. She was the kind of employee that every office depends upon, but nobody sees. She remembered the name of every client's spouse and child. She ensured the conference room coffee was always hot, the filing system always immaculate. She arrived first and left last and never once complained about either fact. She was in the language of performance reviews that always praised her but never promoted her an invaluable member of the support team. Harold Whitfield was the senior partner. 45 years old, a widower for 3 years, the kind of man whose presence altered the atmosphere of every room he entered. Tall, with hair that had gone silver at the temples before its time, and a voice like aged bourbon, slow and warm and meant to be savored. His first wife, Margaret, had died of ovarian cancer when their 3 children were still young, and the tragedy had made him seem both powerful and wounded in a combination that women found irresistible. He asked Eleanor to dinner after 6 months of working together. She was so surprised that she asked him to repeat himself. 6 months of dinners became an engagement. Eleanor said yes, immediately believing she had found both love and safety in a single package. She had grown up without much of either. Her parents were kind but poor. Her education limited to a community college degree earned while working full-time. Harold represented everything she had never had. She had not yet learned that safety and love, when offered by the same person, sometimes come with conditions that are never spoken aloud but are always enforced. The wedding was small by Harold's standards. 80 guests at a church in Beacon Hill, reception at his private club. His 3 children attended with the enthusiasm of prisoners at a parole hearing. Derek was 20, a Harvard sophomore, who spent the entire reception near the bar, radiating hostility. Vivian was 18, already beautiful in the sharp, calculated way of women who understand early that beauty is currency. She wore black to the wedding, true unambiguous funeral black, and when someone commented on it, she said she was still mourning her mother. Connor was 16, the youngest, a quiet boy who said nothing to anyone all day and read a book through the entire reception. It was Vivian who approached Eleanor at the reception. She waited until Eleanor was alone near the dessert table, a brief gap in Harold's protective presence, and crossed the room with the grace of someone who knows she holds all the cards. "You will never be our mother." Her voice was sugar and arsenic. Her eyes were January. "Do not even try." Eleanor had smiled. She had nodded. She had swallowed those words and tucked them away in the place where she kept all the things she could not afford to feel. Because that was what she had been taught. Good women do not make scenes. Good women endure. And so she endured. For 40 years, Eleanor endured. She remembered every birthday for every stepchild, every graduation, every milestone. She sent thoughtful gifts that were received without thanks and sometimes returned without explanation. She hosted holidays, spending days preparing elaborate meals for people who ate in near silence and left as soon as possible. She kept their childhood bedrooms exactly as they had left them, shrines to a past that predated her, dust-free and ready for visits that almost never came. She bit her tongue when Vivian made cutting remarks about her education. She smiled through Derek's barely concealed contempt. She accepted Connor's absolute indifference with the same composure she brought to everything else. And through all of it, she built what she believed was a real marriage. She managed the Brookline Mansion, a grand colonial house that Harold had owned long before meeting her, maintaining its historical details with the care of a museum curator, while simultaneously making it warm enough to feel like a home. She entertained his colleagues and clients, playing the gracious hostess who remembered every dietary restriction and seating preference and conversational sensitivity, who made everyone comfortable and drew no attention to herself. She adapted to his schedule, his preferences, his moods. She learned to read the subtle shifts in his expression, the way sailors read weather, adjusting her behavior to match whatever emotional climate he brought home with him on any given evening. Harold was kind to her in his way. He provided well. He ensured she had appropriate clothing for every social occasion, clothes that he selected or approved that projected the image he wanted his wife to project. He never raised his voice. He never raised his hand. He complimented her management of the house with the genuine appreciation of a man who understood quality work when he saw it. But there had always been distance, a locked room at the center of him that she was never given the key to. He traveled frequently, sometimes for weeks at a time, on business that he described in terms vague enough to discourage further questions. He maintained a home office that was strictly off limits. "I need one space that is just mine, Eleanor. Surely you can understand that." He kept separate bank accounts that she never saw statements for, and the one time she asked about their finances early in the marriage. When she still believed that wives had the right to ask such questions, he had smiled and patted her hand, the way you pat a child who has wandered into a conversation beyond their comprehension. Do not worry your pretty head about money, darling. That is my job. Your job is to make this house a home, and you do it perfectly. So Eleanor had not worried. She had trusted with the completeness that only the truly devoted are capable of, the kind of trust that functions like a load-bearing wall in the architecture of a life. Remove it and everything collapses. So you do not test it. You do not tap on it to check for hollow spaces. You simply believe it is solid and you build everything else on top of it, and you never ever look too closely at the foundation. There was something else, something she noticed but trained herself not to examine. Once a month, sometimes more often, Harold would pack a small leather overnight bag and leave for the weekend. He said he needed to decompress at a property he had inherited from a relative. He said it was nothing, just an old place in the country barely worth mentioning. He said it the way you mention a storage unit or an empty lot, something you own, but that has no emotional significance. Eleanor would pack his bag for him. She would include his favorite reading glasses, in the wool sweater he preferred for cool evenings, in the particular brand of soap that he liked and could not find in most stores. She would kiss him goodbye at the door and watch him drive away, and then spend the weekend alone in the Brookline mansion gardening. If the weather was good, reading. If it was not, existing in the enormous silence of a house built for a family that had never quite materialized around her. She did not ask where exactly this property was. She did not ask what he did there. She did not ask why he never invited her to come along, not once in 40 years. Because good wives trust their husbands. Because asking questions implies doubt. Because doubt implies the foundation might be hollow. And Eleanor could not afford to discover that the foundation was hollow because she had built her entire life on top of it. 40 years of weekends, 40 years of silence, 40 years of not asking the questions that might have changed everything. Sometimes late at night in the years before Harold died, Eleanor would lie awake in the master bedroom and listen to the house settle around her and wonder what it would feel like to know. To actually know with certainty who she was to this man. Whether she was loved or merely tolerated. Whether she was a wife or a convenience. Whether the distance she felt between them was his way of protecting something fragile and precious, or simply the natural shape of indifference. She never found out while he was alive. He died before she could ask, or perhaps more accurately, he died because she never asked. Because the not asking was what allowed everything to continue functioning. The not asking was the oil that kept the machinery of their marriage running smoothly for 4 decades. And now the machine had stopped, and Eleanor was standing in the silence it left behind, holding a cold cup of coffee and wondering whether any of it had been real. The funeral drew over 300 people. Harold Whitfield had been one of Boston's preeminent attorneys for more than 50 years. Judges, politicians, CEOs, and society figures filled the church in rows of expensive black fabric and practiced sorrow. Derek, Vivian, and Connor sat in the front row with their spouses and children, presenting the image of a united grieving family. Derek in a suit that cost more than Eleanor's car. Vivian in black as always, dabbing at eyes that Eleanor noticed were completely dry. Connor staring at his phone beneath the program. They had placed Eleanor in the second row. For space, Derek had explained with a smile that stopped dead before it reached his eyes. In case you have family members who need to sit with you. Eleanor had no family. Her parents had died years ago. She had been an only child. And 40 years of being Harold's wife had meant gradually losing touch with every friend she had once possessed. The second row was not about space. It was a declaration made in front of 300 witnesses that Eleanor was not family. Not blood. Not one of them. That whatever she had been to Harold Whitfield for 40 years, it was not enough to earn her a seat beside the people who shared his DNA. Colleague after colleague rose to eulogize Harold Whitfield, the brilliant legal mind. Harold Whitfield, the devoted father. Harold Whitfield, the pillar of the community, the mentor to young attorneys, the generous philanthropist who had funded scholarships and supported charities and served on boards. They told stories about his sharp wit and his strategic brilliance and his ability to command a courtroom the way a conductor commands an orchestra. Not one person mentioned Harold Whitfield, the husband. Not one person acknowledged the woman who had stood beside him, supported him, built a home for him, adapted her entire existence to accommodate his needs and preferences and ambitions for 4 decades. Not one person turned to the second row and said anything at all to Eleanor. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and her spine very straight and her face perfectly composed, and she thought about how strange it was that you could give 40 years of your life to someone and still be invisible at their funeral. That you could be so thoroughly woven into the fabric of another person's daily existence that removing you would cause the whole thing to unravel, and yet not one person in a room of 300 thought to mention your name. At the reception afterward, held at Derek's expensive Back Bay penthouse with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the harbor, Eleanor stood alone near a window holding a glass of water she was not drinking. The city sparkled below her in the late afternoon light, beautiful and indifferent, and she listened to the hum of conversation around her and felt as though she were watching the event from behind glass. Present but separate, visible but unseen. Then she heard Vivian's voice, carrying from a cluster of friends near the catering table with the unconscious volume of someone who either does not know or does not care that others can hear. "It is just so hard," Vivian was saying, her voice perfectly calibrated for sympathy. "Losing Daddy. At least we have each other. The real family. To get through this. The real family." As if Eleanor had been a guest in her own marriage, an actress in a play that had finally closed, a temp worker whose assignment had run its duration and who could now be thanked politely and shown the door. Eleanor set her glass of water on the windowsill. She picked up her purse. She walked out of the penthouse without saying goodbye to anyone because there was no one to say goodbye to. She drove home to the Brookline mansion and sat in the garden in the dark for a long time listening to the sounds of the city beyond the walls, and she did not cry because she had not yet fully understood what was about to happen to her. The worst was still coming, and it was only 7 days away. The reading of the will took place exactly 1 week after the funeral in the downtown Boston office of Marcus Sheffield, the attorney who had handled Harold's estate planning for the past 20 years. The office occupied the 42nd floor of a glass tower, and the conference room where they gathered had windows on 3 sides offering panoramic views of the city where Harold Whitfield had built his empire of law and reputation and carefully maintained appearances. Eleanor dressed carefully that morning, a simple black dress, modest and appropriate, her white hair styled in the soft wave that Harold had always preferred. Pearl earrings that Harold had given her for their 25th anniversary, one of the few pieces of jewelry he had chosen himself rather than having his assistant select. She applied her makeup with the precision of long practice, covering the dark circles beneath her eyes that 7 nights of broken sleep had deposited there. Her hands trembled slightly as she drove downtown, but she told herself there was no reason to be nervous. 40 years of marriage. Surely Harold had provided for her. Surely after 4 decades of devotion and service and quiet, uncomplaining loyalty, she would be taken care of. Surely. Derek, Vivian, and Connor arrived together in a convoy of expensive cars, each one trailing a personal attorney the way a comet trails debris. They greeted Eleanor with the careful politeness of people who have been coached on appropriate behavior by legal counsel, and they arranged themselves on one side of the long mahogany conference table. 3 siblings, 3 lawyers. A united front of tailored suits and strategically neutral expressions facing Eleanor, who sat alone on the other side with nothing but her pearl earrings and her trembling hands and her 40 years of trust. Marcus Sheffield was a man in his mid-60s with kind eyes behind silver-rimmed glasses and the particular wariness that settles into the faces of attorneys who have spent their careers watching families destroy themselves over money. He opened a leather portfolio and began with the standard legal formalities, the language of testamentary capacity and proper execution in sound mind, the procedural throat-clearing that precedes the reading of every will. Then he got to the specifics. His voice shifted into the careful monotone that lawyers employ when delivering information they desperately wish they did not have to share. The estate of Harold Whitfield is valued at approximately $8.7 million. This includes the primary residence in Brookline, currently valued at $2.1 million. Investment and retirement accounts totaling approximately $6 million, and various other assets including personal property and vehicles. Eleanor felt her shoulders relax slightly. $8.7 million. That was more than enough, more than she had imagined. Maybe Harold had been wise to keep the finances private, protecting and growing this nest egg for their shared future, their shared security in old age. Maybe the distance she had felt was not coldness, but prudence. Maybe he had been taking care of her all along in his quiet, uncommunicative, characteristically Harold way. The primary residence in Brookline Marcus continued, and his voice took on a quality that Eleanor would later recognize as the sound of a man bracing for impact is left in its entirety to Harold's children from his first marriage. Derek Whitfield, Vivian Whitfield, Greer, and Connor Whitfield. To be divided equally among them or sold with proceeds split three ways as they determine appropriate. The first blow landed. Cold tendrils of something that was not quite fear and not quite understanding began creeping up Eleanor's spine. The house. The house where she had lived for 40 years. The house she had maintained and decorated and filled with flowers and warmth and the accumulated artifacts of 4 decades of daily life. Not hers. Never hers. The investment accounts totaling approximately $4.2 million are similarly to be divided equally among Derek Vivian and Connor Whitfield. The cold was spreading through her chest, now wrapping around her lungs, making it difficult to draw a full breath. She felt as though she were watching this happen to someone else, as though she had stepped outside her own body and was observing from a distance that provided clarity but no protection. The retirement accounts valued at approximately $1.8 million. Same distribution to the 3 children. Eleanor's voice came out barely above a whisper, a sound so small it seemed impossible that it could travel across the mahogany expanse of the conference table. Marcus, I do not understand. What about me? What did Harold leave for me? Marcus Sheffield looked at Eleanor with an expression that she would remember for the rest of her life. It was the face of a man who was about to do something that violated every instinct of decency he possessed, who had argued against it and lost, who had been overruled by a dead man's final wishes, and was now required by professional obligation to carry them out. I am getting to your specific bequest now, Eleanor. I have to tell you that I argued against the language Harold used, but he insisted. I am very sorry. He took a breath. The kind of breath you take before diving into water you know is going to be cold. Harold noted in his will, and I am required to read this verbatim. My wife, Eleanor Ann Whitfield, has lived comfortably at my expense for 40 years and has wanted for nothing during the course of our marriage. She has had the benefit of my wealth, my home, my social standing, and a lifestyle far beyond what she could have achieved on her own, working as a secretary. This is more than adequate compensation for her companionship and for the domestic services she has provided over the years. Each word landed like a physical blow. Companionship, domestic services, adequate compensation. 40 years of love and devotion and sacrifice reduced to the language of a janitorial contract, language that reframed her entire marriage as a business arrangement in which she had been the hired help, and Harold had been the generous employer who had already paid her more than she deserved simply by allowing her to live in his house and use his name. Across the table, Derek was smiling, not trying to hide it, not even attempting the pretense of sympathy, smiling with the open satisfaction of a man who had won a competition he had been training for his entire life. Vivian examined her perfectly manicured nails with studied indifference, as though the systematic destruction of a woman's dignity were too routine to warrant her full attention. Connor had his phone out and was texting someone, probably already planning how to spend his share of the inheritance, already converting his father's death into a windfall, already moving on. Marcus continued, his voice heavy, with a regret that was genuine and obvious and completely useless. The will goes on to state, while I have appreciated Eleanor's presence in my home and her efficient management of domestic affairs, I believe my primary obligation and responsibility is to my children and my bloodline. They are my true legacy, the continuation of the Whitfield family name. Therefore, I leave to Eleanor Ann Whitfield only the following. One property I own, located at 47 Oakwood Lane in the town of Thornfield, Massachusetts, along with all contents contained therein. This property is given to Eleanor with the express understanding that she will vacate the Brookline residence within 30 days of my death, as that property is needed by my rightful heirs for their use or disposition as they see fit. The silence that followed was absolute, the kind of silence that exists in the vacuum after an explosion when the air itself has been consumed by the blast and there is nothing left to carry sound. Connor's phone clicked softly as he continued texting. That was the only noise in the room, that tiny, trivial, obscene clicking. Vivian broke the silence. Her voice carried the precise amount of false sympathy that she had perfected over decades of practice, the exact ratio of sweetness to cruelty that allowed her to wound someone while appearing to comfort them. Daddy mentioned that Thornfield property to us years ago. He inherited it from some distant uncle back in the early 80s. He said it was just an old house falling apart way out in the middle of nowhere, not worth the hassle of selling. The property taxes were probably more than it was worth. She smiled at Eleanor with the compassion of a cat watching a mouse bleed. But at least you will have a roof over your head, Eleanor. That is something. Derek stood, already moving on to practical matters, already converting his father's death into a real estate transaction. We will need to discuss the timeline for vacating the Brookline house. We are planning to list it immediately. The market is very strong right now for that neighborhood. The sooner you can be out, the sooner we can get it staged. The will specifies 30 days, Marcus said, and there was a firmness in his voice that had not been there before, a hint of steel beneath the professional courtesy. Eleanor is legally entitled to 30 full days to arrange her affairs and relocate. That is non-negotiable. Of course, Derek said, his voice smooth as oiled silk. We are not unreasonable people. Take your full 30 days, Eleanor. We understand this is a transition. Marcus slid a brown envelope across the polished conference table. His hand trembled slightly as he did so. This contains the deed to the Thornfield property now transferred to your name. There is also a key and a handwritten note from Harold that he asked me to include. Eleanor opened the envelope with fingers that felt as though they belonged to someone else. Inside was an iron key, old and heavily rusted. The kind of key that looked like it belonged in a fairy tale or a nightmare, too old and too heavy for anything in the modern world. And a single sheet of Harold's expensive cream-colored stationery covered in his familiar handwriting, precise and controlled and utterly recognizable. 47 Oakwood Lane, Thornfield, Massachusetts. Eleanor, this is yours now. Go there as soon as you can. You will understand everything once you arrive. I am sorry I could not tell you before, but they were always watching, always listening, always looking for ways to challenge anything I tried to do. Trust me one last time, my darling. All my love, always, Harold. Trust me one last time. After he had just publicly declared her to be nothing more than adequately compensated help. After reducing 40 years of love to a line item in a ledger. After erasing her from his legacy as thoroughly as if she had never existed. Trust me one last time, my darling. The contradiction was so enormous, so incomprehensible, that Eleanor's mind simply could not process it. It was like being handed a note that read, I love you more than anything, on the same day you received divorce papers. Both things could not be true, and yet both things existed in the same handwriting from the same man. Eleanor picked up the brown envelope. She stood on legs that did not feel entirely connected to her body. She walked toward the door without looking at Derek or Vivian or Connor, without acknowledging their existence, because acknowledging them would have required speaking, and speaking would have required opening the door she had locked against the scream that was building inside her chest, the scream that had been building for 40 years and was now pressing against her ribs with a force that threatened to crack them. Eleanor Marcus called after her. If you need anything, if you have questions about any of this, please call me. I mean that. She nodded without turning around. She walked out of the conference room and down the corridor and into the elevator and through the marble lobby and across the parking garage to her car, her 10-year-old Honda Civic that Harold had never suggested she replace because it was appropriate for a woman of her station, practical and modest and unremarkable, just like the woman who drove it. She sat behind the wheel and closed the door, and then the scream came, not from her throat, from somewhere deeper, from the place where she had stored 40 years of swallowed words and suppressed emotions and carefully managed pain. It came out not as sound, but as tears of flood so violent and so total that it felt like drowning, like being pulled under by a current she had no strength to resist. She cried until her body ached. She cried until her eyes swelled shut. She cried until there was nothing left inside her. No grief, no anger, no fear, nothing at all. Just emptiness. The hollow, echoing emptiness of a house that has been stripped of everything that made it a home. The 30 days that followed were a masterclass in calculated cruelty performed by people who had been practicing entitlement their entire lives. Derek, Vivian, and Connor came to the Brookline house nearly every day, bringing contractors with tool belts and interior designers with fabric swatches and real estate agents with measuring tapes and confident opinions about the current market. They walked through rooms that still contained Eleanor's belongings, her books still on the shelves, her clothes still in the closets, her photographs still on the walls, and they discussed renovations and demolitions and staging strategies as though the house were already empty, as though she had already gone. One morning, Eleanor was sitting at the kitchen table drinking coffee, the same kitchen where she had prepared thousands of meals over 40 years, and Vivian walked through with an interior designer without so much as a glance in her direction. "We will definitely open up this whole space," Vivian was saying, gesturing at the walls that held 4 decades of Eleanor's carefully curated family photographs. "Knock out this wall, create a huge open-concept kitchen, dining, living area. That is what sells now." The designer nodded and made notes on a tablet, and neither of them acknowledged the woman sitting 3 feet away, watching her life being erased in real time. Another afternoon, a real estate agent toured the house while Eleanor sat reading in the living room. The agent and Derek stood perhaps 3 feet from her chair, discussing comparable property values and staging strategies and the importance of curb appeal, and Eleanor sat perfectly still with her book open on her lap and realized that she had become a ghost. Not metaphorically, actually, she had become invisible to the people around her, a transparent figure occupying space but possessing no substance, no weight, no claim on the attention of the living. The agent looked through the window at Eleanor's garden. "The gardens are significantly overgrown," she noted with professional detachment. "We will need professional landscaping crews to clean all that up before we can list. First impressions are everything in this market." Those were Eleanor's gardens. Every rose bush selected for fragrance and bloom time and disease resistance. Every perennial chosen to complement its neighbors in color and height and texture. Every herb planted because Eleanor loved to cook and loved the feeling of walking outside her own kitchen door to snip fresh basil or rosemary or thyme. 40 years of knowledge and labor and love. And to this woman with her measuring tape and her market analysis, they were just overgrown obstacles to a profitable sale. The nights were the worst. Eleanor would lie awake in the master bedroom, which Derek had graciously allowed her to continue using, since the furniture needs to stay in place for staging purposes anyway, and her mind would spiral through increasingly catastrophic scenarios. She was 68 years old. She had no job, no career, no work experience, less than 4 decades old. The last time she had earned a paycheck had been 1984, the year she married Harold, the year she had traded her independence for the security of being someone's wife. Who would hire her now? What could she possibly offer an employer? Her skills were domestic. She could cook elaborate meals. She could manage a household. She could arrange flowers and plan seating charts, and remember the names of people she had met once at a party 7 years ago. These were not skills that appeared on resumes. These were not skills that LinkedIn profiles were built around. The Thornfield property was almost certainly worthless, exactly as Vivian had described. An old house in the middle of nowhere inherited from a forgotten relative worth maybe $50,000 or $60,000 if she was extremely lucky. That might sustain her for 3 or 4 years if she was incredibly frugal. And then what, 72 years old and destitute, dependent on government assistance, living in some subsidized facility for the elderly, poor, wearing donated clothes and eating institutional food, and wondering how a woman who had once hosted dinner parties for judges and senators had ended up here. Some nights the terror was so absolute that Eleanor could not breathe. Her heart would hammer against her ribs, and her chest would constrict, and she would throw off the covers and pace the bedroom in the dark, walking the perimeter of the room like an animal in a cage, gasping for air that seemed to have been sucked out of the space, leaving nothing but vacuum and fear. Other nights, the fear transformed into rage, a white-hot, incandescent fury that surprised her with its intensity because she had never allowed herself to feel anger. Not really, not the full force of it. How dare Harold do this to her? How dare he let her spend 40 years in the comfortable delusion that they were partners, that they were building a life together, that she was safe only to reveal in death that she had been nothing more than staff? How dare he choose his entitled, selfish, ungrateful children over the woman who had devoted her entire adult life to making him comfortable? But rage requires fuel, and maintaining anger is exhausting work. especially when you are simultaneously terrified of the future and grieving the past and packing up a life that turned out to be built on a foundation that was not merely hollow but non-existent. So mostly Eleanor just felt numb, moving through the mechanical motions of dismantling 40 years with the efficiency of a woman who has spent her entire adult life being efficient. 3 suitcases of clothing, 2 boxes of personal items, photographs of her parents and her younger self, letters her mother had written, a few books that had belonged to her grandmother. That was it. 40 years compressed into 5 containers that fit easily in the trunk and back seat of a 10-year-old Honda Civic. On day 28, Eleanor was standing at the kitchen sink when she overheard Derek and Vivian talking in the dining room. They either did not know she was there or did not care. Given 40 years of evidence, she suspected the latter. "I honestly cannot believe Father left her anything at all," Vivian said. "That Thornfield property is probably worth $50,000 at most. He should have left her absolutely nothing." "He felt guilty," Derek replied. 40 years is a long time to string someone along, even if she was essentially just the help. The Thornfield place was his way of easing his conscience without actually reducing what we got. "Well, she should be grateful we are being so civilized about this transition," Vivian said. "Most women her age with absolutely no skills and no family would end up in subsidized housing or worse. At least she will be able to sell that dump and have a little nest egg for a few years." They laughed together. The easy, untroubled laughter of people who have never struggled for anything, who have never lain awake at 3 in the morning, calculating how many months they could survive on $50,000, who have never known the particular brand of terror that comes from being old and alone and utterly without resources in a world that has no patience for any of those things. Eleanor stood at the sink and gripped the edge of the counter until her knuckles went white and the tendons in her forearms stood out like cables. She wanted to scream. She wanted to march into that dining room and tell them exactly what she thought of their entitlement and their cruelty and their absolute absence of basic human decency. She wanted to say that she had wiped their noses and cooked their meals and kept their childhood bedrooms intact for 40 years and had received nothing in return but contempt. She wanted to say that their mother, God rest her soul, would be ashamed of the people they had become. But she did not, because 40 years of conditioning held her in place like an invisible hand pressed firmly against her chest. Swallow it. Smile. Endure. Let the moment pass the way she had let 10,000 moments pass before it. On her final morning in the house, Eleanor woke at dawn and walked through each room one last time. She expected to be overwhelmed by memories. She expected 40 years of accumulated life to press in on her from every surface and every corner, suffocating her with the weight of everything she was losing. Instead, she felt almost nothing. The master bedroom was just a room, 4 walls, a window, furniture that had never truly been hers. The guest bedrooms she had maintained like museums were just empty spaces dedicated to people who had never wanted to be there. The living room, where she had hosted hundreds of gatherings, was just a stage where she had performed a role that nobody had bothered to watch. The only place that hurt was the garden. She stood among the roses she had planted that first optimistic spring in 1985, the year after her marriage, when she still believed that love and effort were enough to build a life on. She touched the leaves of the herb garden she had created from her love of cooking. She walked the paths between the perennial beds she had designed to bloom in a continuous sequence from the first crocuses of March to the last chrysanthemums of November, so that there was never a day in 8 months when something was not flowering. This garden was the only space in 40 years that had been authentically hers, and now it would be torn out by professional landscaping crews who would replace it with whatever the real estate market demanded. Low-maintenance shrubs, mulched beds, a lawn that required nothing from anyone and gave nothing back. The physical manifestation of everything that was wrong with the world that had just discarded her. Eleanor loaded her car at 1 in the afternoon, 3 suitcases, 2 boxes, the wedding photograph she had taken from the mantel, despite Derek's objection that it was technically house property. She had looked at him when he said that, really looked at him, and something in her expression had made him take a step backward and close his mouth. Derek arrived at 1:30, early. He stood on the front steps with his hands in his pockets, watching her carry the last box to the car, not offering to help, just watching, to make sure she actually left on time. Derek, Eleanor heard herself say. Her voice was quiet, but it carried a weight she had not known she possessed, the weight of 14,600 mornings and 40 years of silence, and a lifetime of words she had swallowed that were now pressing against her teeth, demanding to be spoken. Do you have any idea what it is like to give someone 40 years of your life and be told it meant nothing? Derek's face flushed red. Father left you a property. You are not getting nothing. Your father left me a mystery, a house I have never seen in a town I have never heard of. You and your siblings received millions of dollars, and this mansion in the satisfaction of knowing your father valued you as his legacy. I received a rusty key and 30 days to disappear from the only home I have known for 4 decades. So no, Derek. I do not think you have any concept of what this has been like. She got in her car before he could respond, before she could say anything else, before the numbness that had been shielding her for 7 weeks could crack entirely and release everything she had stored behind it. The brown envelope sat on the passenger seat. Her GPS displayed the address. 47 Oakwood Lane, Thornfield, Massachusetts. 2 hours and 14 minutes to a completely unknown future. Eleanor Ann Whitfield started the engine, pulled away from the curb, and drove away from Brookline, away from the mansion, away from the garden, away from the life she had thought she was living. And as she drove west through Massachusetts, through suburbs that gave way to small towns that gave way to forest, toward Thornfield, and whatever waited for her there, she made herself a single promise. Whatever she found at the end of that drive, whether it was shelter or complete ruin, value or utter worthlessness, she would find a way to survive it. She was 68 years old with nothing left to lose except her dignity. And she would be damned if she would lose that too. Because sometimes she was beginning to understand having absolutely nothing left to lose becomes its own peculiar, terrible, liberating kind of freedom. When the worst has already happened, when everything you built has been taken and everything you believed has been proven false, there is a strange clarity that settles over you like the silence after a storm. The world looks different from the bottom, simpler, more honest, stripped of all the comfortable illusions that kept you from seeing things as they actually are. Eleanor drove west. The city fell away behind her. The road narrowed. The trees grew taller. And somewhere ahead in a town she had never heard of, at the end of a dirt road she had never traveled, a door was waiting for a rusty iron key and the woman who carried it. Thornfield, Massachusetts announced itself gradually the way small towns do when they have nothing to prove and nowhere to rush toward. The highway narrowed to a state road, the state road narrowed to a county road, and the county road eventually became a 2-lane stretch of cracked asphalt lined with stone walls so old they predated the nation itself. The trees grew thicker and taller with every mile, ancient oaks and maples pressing close to the road like spectators leaning in to witness something important. Eleanor drove slowly, both hands on the wheel, her eyes scanning the landscape for any sign of the town that held her future. The brown envelope sat on the passenger seat where it had ridden for 2 hours like a silent companion, the rusty iron key inside it occasionally shifting with a faint metallic whisper whenever she took a curve. The sound was small but persistent, a reminder that she was carrying something that might unlock a door or might unlock nothing at all. She had spent the entire drive trying not to think, trying not to replay the words from the will, trying not to hear Vivian's voice saying, "At least you will have a roof over your head," trying not to feel the bottomless terror of being 68 years old and driving toward a house she had never seen in a town she had never heard of, with everything she owned fitting inside 3 suitcases and 2 cardboard boxes in the back seat. Instead, she thought about the note. "Trust me one last time, my darling." Written by the same hand that had written, "She has been adequately compensated for her domestic services." How could both things come from the same man? How could Harold reduce her to a servant in one document and call her his darling in another? Either the note was his final cruelty, a twist of the knife designed to give her false hope on top of real devastation, or there was something she did not yet understand, something hidden beneath the surface of what had happened in Marcus Sheffield's conference room, something that would only reveal itself when she turned that rusty key in a lock she had never seen. She was not sure which possibility frightened her more, that Harold had been cruel or that Harold had been something else entirely, something she had never imagined, something that would require her to rethink everything she thought she knew about her marriage, her husband, and herself. The town appeared around a bend without warning. A cluster of perhaps 15 buildings arranged around a small central square, a general store with a faded green awning, a diner with checkered curtains, a post office barely larger than a garden shed, a gas station with two pumps, a white clapboard church with a modest steeple, a library built from gray fieldstone with a carved sign reading Thornfield Public Library, established 1847. It was the kind of town that time had not forgotten so much as agreed to leave, mostly alone. Eleanor drove slowly down Main Street, and something strange happened. People stopped what they were doing to watch her pass, not with suspicion, but with something that looked almost like recognition, as if they had been waiting. An elderly man sweeping the sidewalk in front of the general store paused and raised his hand in a deliberate wave. A woman arranging flowers outside the diner turned to watch and nodded to herself. A group of teenagers on the library steps looked up from their phones with genuine curiosity. Eleanor's hands tightened on the steering wheel. How could they know her? She had never been to this town, and yet they watched her with the unmistakable familiarity of people greeting someone whose arrival had been anticipated. Her GPS directed her onto Oakwood Lane. The pavement lasted about 200 yards before surrendering to hard-packed dirt, and the road led into forest so dense and old that afternoon sunlight barely penetrated. Oak trees lined both sides, their trunks massive enough to suggest they had been standing when the Constitution was signed. Their branches interlocked overhead, creating a living tunnel of green light and shifting shadow that made driving feel like entering a cathedral built by time itself. The road was rough, rutted with old tire tracks studded with stones that scraped the undercarriage barely wide enough for a single vehicle. She drove slowly and carefully, wincing at every bump, her low-clearance sedan protesting terrain it was never designed to navigate. Through the trees on both sides, she caught occasional glimpses of stone walls running parallel to the road, ancient boundaries established by farmers who had cleared this land centuries ago, before the forest reclaimed it, before the oaks grew tall enough to block the sky. After about a mile, the GPS announced cheerfully that she had arrived at her destination. Eleanor stopped the car and sat for a long moment, afraid to look up, afraid that Vivian had been right and she would find nothing but a collapsing ruin. Then she took a breath, and she looked up. The house stood in a large clearing, surrounded by those ancient oaks, and it was nothing like what she had been told. Built from gray fieldstone, dating to the early 1800s at least, it rose 2 stories to a steep slate roof that looked remarkably intact. White painted wooden trim framed leaded glass windows that caught the afternoon light. A heavy oak door sat beneath a small covered portico supported by carved wooden columns. Ivy climbed portions of the stone walls in patterns that looked intentional rather than neglectful, like something from an English country estate. The grounds were overgrown, but not abandoned. Eleanor's trained eye recognized immediately the difference between neglect and wildness. Stone pathways wound through the grounds partially hidden by grass. Rose beds had grown wild, but were clearly alive. A kitchen garden had become a glorious tangle of herbs and wildflowers. And there was a fountain, a stone basin with a carved center column, dry and silent, but standing with dignity. It was wild and overgrown and hauntingly, heartbreakingly beautiful. Like a secret garden that time had tried to reclaim but could not quite destroy. Eleanor was still sitting in the car when she heard footsteps on the dirt road from the direction of town. An elderly woman was approaching mid-70s, wearing a simple cotton house dress and carrying a wicker basket covered with a checkered cloth. She walked with surprising purpose and energy. "You are Eleanor." It was not a question. She spoke with absolute certainty. "Yes." Eleanor climbed out on the unsteady legs. "How did you know? We have been waiting for you." The woman said it the way she might have said the sun came up this morning or winter follows autumn. A simple statement of how things work. "Harold told us you would come eventually after he passed. He said to watch for a woman named Eleanor driving an older Honda. I am Dorothy Pemberton. I run the general store in town." She held out the basket with a gesture that was both offering and welcome. "Bread, eggs, milk, coffee, cheese. Figured you might need supplies. The house has been maintained, but there is no fresh food stocked." Eleanor took the basket automatically, the way you catch something that has been tossed to you before your conscious mind has time to decide whether you want to catch it. Her hands knew what to do, even when her brain was paralyzed. "Harold told you when he never once mentioned this place to me. In 40 years of marriage." Dorothy's expression shifted into something more complex. Understanding mixed with sympathy, mixed with the particular kind of sadness that comes from knowing a story that someone else is only now beginning to hear. Harold came here regularly for 40 years, dear. At least once a month, sometimes more frequently, especially in the last few years, when his health was declining, and I think he knew he did not have much time left. He maintained the house, took care of the property as best he could, spent time here. Sometimes a weekend, sometimes longer. He told us, the people in town who knew him, that when he died, his wife Eleanor would inherit this place. He said you would not know about it beforehand because he had kept it secret, for your protection. My protection, Eleanor felt as though someone had picked up the world she was standing on and rotated it 90 degrees so that what had been the floor was now the wall, and what had been the wall was now the ceiling, and she was expected to continue standing upright as though nothing had changed. Protection from what? From them, I imagine, Dorothy said gently but directly, the way people in small towns tend to speak about difficult truths without the elaborate verbal cushioning that city people use to soften unpleasant realities. The ones who took everything else. His children from the first marriage. Harold said they'd never accepted you, that they always resented him for marrying you, and that if they ever discovered this property existed, if they ever learned what it was really worth, they would hire lawyers and find ways to claim it, to take it from you. So he hid it from everyone, including you, for 40 years, until his death would make the transfer final and legally unassailable. 40 years. The number echoed in Eleanor's mind like a bell struck in an empty room. Harold had been coming here for 40 years, every monthly weekend trip, every time he said he was going to decompress at the inherited property. Every time Eleanor had packed his bag and kissed him goodbye and spent the weekend alone and had not asked questions because good wives trust their husbands. He had been driving to this house, to this clearing in this forest, to this secret he had been keeping since 3 months after their wedding. She felt something enormous moving beneath the surface of her understanding, like a whale passing under a small boat. She could not see it yet. She could not comprehend its full shape or size. But she could feel the displacement of everything she had previously believed, the sudden instability of a reality she had thought was solid, and she knew that when this thing finally surfaced, when she finally saw it clearly, nothing would ever look the same. "Come on," Dorothy said, starting up the stone pathway toward the front door and gesturing for Eleanor to follow. "Let me help you get settled in. The house is unlocked. Harold never locked it. He said there was nothing here that anyone in Thornfield would want to steal, and if someone needed shelter, they were welcome to use it. That was the kind of man he was, at least here, at least in this place where he could be whoever he actually wanted to be." The rusty iron key turned smoothly in the lock despite its aged appearance. Whatever mechanism it operated had been maintained and oiled with the same careful attention that characterized everything else about this house. The heavy oak door swung open with barely a sound, its hinges moving with the silent precision of hardware that has been properly cared for over decades. "Welcome to your sanctuary," Dorothy said, stepping aside so that Eleanor could enter first. Her voice was soft, almost reverent, as though she were ushering someone into a church. That is what Harold called it. The sanctuary. "Welcome home, Eleanor." Eleanor stepped across the threshold and felt something shift inside her so fundamentally that she would later describe it as the moment she became a different person. Not because she changed, but because the world around her revealed itself to be completely different from what she had believed it to be. And when the world changes that dramatically, the person standing in it cannot help but change too. The interior was beautiful, not faded or neglected, but beautiful in the way that only decades of careful, loving attention can produce. Wide plank wood floors glowed with warm amber patina. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall, a deep leather sofa, reading chairs by the windows, built-in bookshelves filled with leather-bound volumes, hand-woven rugs, and the light filtered through forest and old glass moved across the floors like something alive. But it was not the architecture or the light that stopped Eleanor's breath. It was the photographs. They were everywhere, covering every wall, arranged on every shelf, standing on every surface. Dozens of them, scores of them, and every single one was a photograph of Eleanor. Eleanor on their wedding day, radiant and full of hope. Eleanor in the Brookline garden, kneeling in soil with joy on her face. Eleanor laughing, head thrown back in a moment of genuine happiness. Eleanor reading by the window, sunlight catching her hair. Eleanor sleeping on what appeared to be the porch of this very house. Eleanor at every age in every season in unguarded moments throughout their 40-year marriage. All carefully photographed, beautifully framed, displayed like a private museum dedicated entirely to her. It was a shrine, built and maintained over 40 years by a man who could not show his love publicly and had instead expressed it here in this hidden place. He loved you very much. Dorothy's voice came from behind her, quiet and matter-of-fact, stating something she considered so obvious it barely needed saying. Anyone who walked into this house understood that immediately. This was his shrine to you, his secret place where he could come and be the person he actually was, instead of the person his Boston life and his children required him to be. Eleanor put her hand against the wall to steady herself because her legs had stopped cooperating and the room was tilting, and her vision was blurred by tears that had appeared without warning. Tears she did not remember, summoning tears that simply materialized on her face the way rain materializes from clouds that have been building pressure for a very long time. She had not cried at the funeral because she had been too stunned. She had not cried during the will reading because she had been too numb. She had not cried during the 30 days of being systematically erased because she had been too terrified. But here in this room, surrounded by this overwhelming, undeniable floor-to-ceiling and wall-to-wall evidence that Harold Whitfield had not discarded her, had not reduced her to domestic services, had not forgotten her or dismissed her, or relegated her to a footnote in his legacy, but had instead spent 40 years building an entire secret world dedicated to the love he felt for her, something inside Eleanor that had been holding itself together through sheer force of will, simply let go. She cried the way you cry when you discover that the person you thought had abandoned you was actually the whole time building you a lifeboat. Dorothy stood quietly by the door and let her grieve or celebrate or do whatever this was, this enormous release that was not quite sorrow and not quite joy, but something far larger and more complicated than either something that encompassed 40 years of confusion and loneliness and wondering and hoping and giving up hope and finding it again in the last place she expected, in a house made of stone and secrets and photographs that proved she had been loved all along. When the tears finally subsided into the ragged breathing that follows a storm, Dorothy guided Eleanor to the leather sofa and sat beside her. "There is more," Dorothy said. Her voice was kind but serious, the voice of someone who knows that the story is only half told and that the second half is even more important than the first. "Then I will leave you to rest and process everything. But first you need to see it all. You need to understand what Harold actually left you, because it is not just a house." She showed Eleanor the kitchen, where an antique wood-burning stove stood alongside modern appliances in a combination that should have been incongruous but somehow worked perfectly. Copper pots hung from ceiling racks. A deep farmhouse sink was set beneath a window that overlooked the forest. Open shelves displayed dishes and glassware that were beautiful and obviously old, and clearly not the kind of thing you buy in bulk from a catalog. She showed her the dining room with its long oak table that could seat 12, and the 3 bedrooms upstairs, each furnished simply but with obvious care, and the master bedroom with its fireplace and its forest views, and dozens more photographs of Eleanor, including candid shots that she had never known were being taken, pictures of her cooking and reading and gardening and sleeping and simply existing in the ordinary moments of daily life that she had never considered worth documenting, but that Harold apparently had considered priceless. "The house has been maintained through a fund Harold set up years ago," Dorothy explained as they descended the stairs. "He arranged everything through the local bank. Utilities, property taxes, insurance, maintenance, repairs. All of it is covered for the next 50 years. You will not have to pay for any of it. Ever. He made sure of that. 50 years. Half a century of financial protection for a house his wife did not know existed." Then Dorothy led her to a door beneath the staircase that Eleanor had not noticed. A door that looked like it might lead to a closet or a small storage space. Dorothy opened it to reveal a room that was neither. It was a study, perhaps 10 feet by 12 with no windows, lit by the warm glow of a green-shaded banker's lamp on an antique mahogany desk. 3 walls were lined floor to ceiling with built-in shelving, and instead of books, the shelves held folders and binders and document boxes, hundreds of them, all meticulously labeled in Harold's precise handwriting. Legal documents, financial records, property records, trust documents, personal files organized by name and date and subject matter, covering what appeared to be decades of careful systematic documentation. The fourth wall was the desk itself, a beautiful antique piece with a leather writing surface and brass hardware, and a matching chair that showed the kind of wear that comes from years of regular use. Someone had sat in this chair many times for many hours doing careful and important work. And there in the exact center of the desk, positioned with the unmistakable intentionality of something that had been placed there specifically for Eleanor to find, was a thick cream-colored envelope. Written across it in Harold's familiar script in ink that had the slightly faded look of words written some time ago and left to wait were four words. "My beloved Eleanor," this Dorothy said, and her voice was barely a whisper now, as though she understood that what was about to happen in this room was sacred and should be witnessed only softly. "This is what he really wanted you to find. This is why he built the sanctuary." Eleanor picked up the envelope. It was heavy. The paper was the same expensive cream stock that Harold had used for every important document in his professional life, the paper he reserved for contracts and agreements and letters that carried legal weight. He had sealed it with actual wax, pressing what appeared to be a signet ring into the warm red pool to create an impression that looked like intertwined initials. The whole thing felt ceremonial, ancient, like something from a time when written words were treated as objects of power, which they are, though the modern world has largely forgotten this. She broke the seal. Inside were 5 pages of Harold's handwriting, dense and careful and precise, covering both sides of each sheet. The handwriting of a man who had spent his life choosing words with the exactness of a surgeon choosing where to cut, who understood that the right word in the right place can save a life, and the wrong word can end one. "My dearest, most beloved Eleanor, if you are reading this, I am gone, and you have found the sanctuary. I am desperately and profoundly sorry it had to happen this way." And then the letter told her everything. It told her that the cruel language of the will, the words that had reduced her to domestic services and adequate compensation, had been written deliberately with calculation and purpose. Harold had chosen those words specifically because they were the words that Derek and Vivian and Connor expected to hear, the words that confirmed their belief that their father's second marriage had been a transaction rather than a love story. He had given them the narrative they wanted, the version of reality they had always insisted was true, because as long as they believed they had won, they would not look for hidden treasures. They would not suspect that the game had another level. They would take their millions and their mansion and their victory, and they would walk away satisfied, never knowing that the real inheritance had been given to the woman they despised. It told her that the Brookline mansion was not the prize the children thought it was. Harold had taken a substantial mortgage against it 2 years before his death, a debt that the heirs would now discover they were responsible for. He had filed historical preservation easements that would make any sale a bureaucratic nightmare of committee reviews and environmental assessments and neighborhood approval processes lasting months or years. The property taxes alone for a house of that size in that neighborhood would be a significant financial burden. The children had inherited not a windfall but a money pit, and they would not realize it until they were already committed. The letter told her about the trusts. The structures Harold had created for his children's inheritances were not simple accounts they could access at will. They were elaborately designed financial instruments with conditions so specific and restrictions so demanding that accessing the money would be for each of them a particular kind of torture tailored to their individual weaknesses. Derek's trust required continuous employment verified by annual tax returns and character evaluations conducted by a retired federal judge named William Hoffman, a man Harold had chosen specifically for his legendary inflexibility on matters of ethics and personal conduct. Derek, who had changed jobs 11 times in 20 years and whose ethical standards in business were, according to Harold's documentation, significantly below the threshold that Judge Hoffman would accept. Vivian's trust included a requirement for stable family relationships defined by specific and measurable criteria that an independent evaluator would assess annually. Vivian, who had been divorced 3 times and was currently estranged from 2 of her own 3 children. Connor's trust was structured as a managed investment vehicle that required his personal hands-on daily involvement in the management decisions. If at any point he delegated that management to someone else, the entire fund would automatically dissolve, and the assets would transfer to a list of charitable organizations that Harold had selected. Connor, who had never personally managed anything in his life, and whose primary skill was paying other people to handle things he found tedious. Harold had given his children exactly what they wanted in exactly the form that would make them absolutely miserable. And then the letter told her about Thornfield. The house sat on 247 acres of protected woodland. Conservation organizations had been approached and had expressed serious interest in purchasing the land at a valuation of approximately $3.2 million. The house itself, as a historical structure with significant architectural merit, had been assessed at roughly $800,000. The deed had been in Eleanor's name since 1984, established as a personal gift from Harold, entirely separate from their marital property. Marcus Sheffield had helped design the legal structure specifically to ensure that it was untouchable by any future challenge from Harold's other heirs. It was legally and absolutely and permanently hers. The filing cabinets in the study contained 40 years of documentation that Harold had accumulated during his career as one of Boston's most prominent and well-connected attorneys. Information about powerful families and influential individuals and the kind of private dealings that the people involved believed were buried so deep they would never see daylight. Harold had never used this information. The letter was clear about that. Using it would have been unethical, a violation of attorney-client privilege and basic human decency. And despite his many failures as a husband and as a man, Harold had maintained this particular line throughout his career. But he had kept the documentation organized and maintained and updated because information is insurance. And insurance is what you need when the people who might come after you have unlimited resources and no scruples. The files labeled with his children's names contained documentation of financial dealings, business transactions, legal arrangements, and personal matters that Derek and Vivian and Connor would prefer stayed private. Harold had left them as Eleanor's last line of defense. Use them only if you must, the letter said, but know that they are there, and know that the threat of using them will almost certainly be enough. My children are many things, but they are not brave. They will not risk public exposure of their secrets when the alternative is simply leaving you alone. The letter ended with words that Eleanor read 3 times each reading, revealing layers of meaning she had missed before. You were the best part of my life, Eleanor. The only pure, good, real thing in a life that was otherwise full of performance and obligation and maintaining appearances. I am sorry I was too much of a coward to stand up to my children's judgment. I am sorry I prioritized keeping peace over publicly defending the woman I loved. I am sorry I made you feel second best when you were always, always first in my heart. I failed you in life by being weak. I hope I have succeeded in death by being clever. This sanctuary is yours, to live in, to sell, to transform into whatever you wish. But know that it was created from love, protected by love, and given to you with more love than I ever managed to express while breathing. You deserve someone braver than me. You deserve someone strong enough to choose you publicly over avoiding conflict. But I gave you what I could. This place, this protection, this proof that you were cherished even when I was too weak to show it. Forever and always yours, Harold. Eleanor set the letter on the desk. She looked at the filing cabinets lining the walls. She opened the top drawer of the first cabinet and found property deeds confirming her sole ownership since 1984. Financial documents detailing the maintenance trust, legal opinions from 3 separate law firms confirming the unassailable nature of the gift structure. Everything Harold had described, verified, and documented and organized with the meticulous precision of a man who had spent 50 years understanding exactly how legal systems work and exactly how to build structures within them that could not be dismantled. She opened the folder labeled with the children's names and found exactly what Harold had described. Derek's business dealings documented in exhaustive detail. Vivian's divorce settlements annotated with discrepancies and questionable arrangements. Connor's company financials flagged with irregularities that any competent tax investigator would find interesting. Eleanor closed the folder. She sat in Harold's chair, and she began to laugh. She could not help it. After 7 weeks of shock and grief and humiliation and terror, after being told she was nothing, and discovering she was everything after driving 2 hours into the unknown and finding not ruin but a fortress, she sat in this hidden study, in this secret house surrounded by 40 years of meticulous preparation, and she laughed until her sides ached. She laughed until tears ran down her face again, but different tears this time, tears that were not grief, but something closer to wonder. She laughed until Dorothy, still standing in the doorway, began laughing too, both of them understanding the extraordinary scope of what Harold Whitfield had done, the patience of it, the precision of it, the perfectly legal, perfectly timed, perfectly devastating brilliance of a man who had spent his entire career understanding how power works and had used every ounce of that understanding to protect the woman he loved from the people he knew would try to destroy her. He was a complicated man, Dorothy said when the laughter finally subsided. Flawed, certainly, weak in some ways, but his love for you was never complicated. That was the one simple thing about him. Over the following months, Eleanor began to discover who Harold had really been in Thornfield, and the man who emerged from these discoveries bore so little resemblance to the distant, compartmentalized husband she had known in Boston that she sometimes felt she was learning about two entirely different people who happened to share the same name and the same face. Pastor Thomas Brennan, a kind man in his early 60s with a gentle voice and calloused hands that suggested he spent as much time doing physical labor as spiritual counseling, had told Eleanor that Harold had paid for the complete replacement of the church roof 3 years earlier. The total cost had been significant tens of thousands of dollars, and Harold had written a check without hesitation and without conditions. He would not allow his name on a plaque, would not allow an announcement to the congregation, would not allow any public acknowledgement whatsoever. He just said a church needs a sound roof to shelter its people, Pastor Brennan told Eleanor. And then he asked me not to tell anyone. I kept that promise while he was alive. But I think he would want you to know now, Ruth Patterson, an 80-year-old woman who had lived in Thornfield her entire life and who remembered when the general store was a blacksmith shop and the library was a one-room schoolhouse, told Eleanor that Harold had paid her grandson's entire college tuition, set up an anonymous scholarship through the local community foundation. But we figured out it was him, Ruth said with a smile that lit up her weathered face. Was not hard. But nobody else in town had that kind of money, and nobody else would have done it so quietly. Changed my grandson's whole life. He is an engineer now, first person in our family to get a college degree going back 5 generations. That was Harold's doing. Sarah Caldwell, the young librarian, told Eleanor about the time the town budget was cut and the library was scheduled to close. Harold had driven to Thornfield on a Wednesday, which was unusual because he usually came on weekends, and he had walked into the library and asked Sarah how much it would cost to keep the doors open for another year and how many books the library needed. She had given him numbers she thought were reasonable, and he had written a check for twice the amount and told her to buy 5,000 new books. He said a town without a library is not really a town. It is just a collection of buildings with people in them. Sarah's eyes were bright with the memory. He said books are what turn a place into a community. And then he sat down in the reading room and read for 3 hours before driving back to Boston. Harold had lived an entirely different life here. A life characterized by generosity and engagement and genuine connection with a community that valued him not for his legal brilliance or his social standing or his wealth, but for his kindness and his willingness to show up, and his quiet, consistent, unasked for acts of support. In Thornfield, Harold Whitfield had been the man he wanted to be rather than the man his Boston life required him to be, and the people of Thornfield had loved him for it. Dorothy told Eleanor the most. Sitting on the stone porch of the sanctuary one evening, with the autumn forest blazing red and gold around them and the first chill of approaching winter in the air, Dorothy described a Harold that Eleanor had never known and could barely recognize. He talked about you constantly. Every single visit without exception, he would stop by the store and we would sit on the bench out front and talk. He always asked me if I thought the house was ready for you, if there was anything more that should be done. He would show me photographs on his phone, pictures he had taken of you without your knowing, and he would tell me stories about you, about how you sang when you thought no one was listening, about how your face looked when you were concentrating on something in the garden, about how you made coffee for him every single morning for 40 years, and how it was always perfect, and how he never told you that it was the best part of his day. Dorothy paused, looking out at the forest with an expression that suggested she was remembering something specific and private. He said you were the only person who had ever loved him for himself, not for what he could do for you or what he could provide, just for him. He said keeping you separate from his children, keeping you secret from this place was the hardest thing he had ever done, and the most important. Eleanor would learn later from a journal she found in the desk drawer that Harold had come closest to telling her the truth on a November evening in 2012. He had been sitting at the sanctuary desk looking at a photograph of Eleanor laughing in the Brookline garden, and he had written in the margin of his legal pad in handwriting, less controlled than usual, the single sentence, "Tell her tonight." But when he returned to Boston the next morning, Derek had called before breakfast, demanding to discuss estate planning, using words like equitable distribution and legal entitlement. And Harold had put the legal pad in the drawer and locked it and said nothing. He had chosen silence over the risk of losing the one thing he had built that his children could not touch. It was, Eleanor understood now, both the bravest and most cowardly decision of his life. 5 months after her arrival, as autumn began to color the forest around the sanctuary, the phone rang. Marcus Sheffield's name on the screen. "Eleanor, I hope you are settling in well. I wanted to let you know that Derek has retained attorneys to challenge the will. He is arguing that the Thornfield property should be considered a marital asset subject to division. He wants a court to force you to sell and split the proceeds 4 ways. On what grounds? He is claiming that Harold deliberately understated the property's value in the will, and that any significant asset acquired during the marriage should be subject to equitable distribution regardless of how it was titled." Eleanor looked at the filing cabinets lining the walls of Harold's study. She thought about the letter. She thought about the photographs. She thought about a man who had spent 40 years building her a fortress because he knew this day would come. "Let him try, Marcus. I have everything I need." Her voice was steady, calm. The voice of a woman who had been afraid for months and had sometime in the slow, peaceful days of summer and early fall, without quite noticing the transition, stopped being afraid. But later that night, alone in the sanctuary for the first time, Eleanor sat at Harold's desk and confronted a question that was not about legal strategy or financial security or even self-defense. It was about who she wanted to be. The files were there. Harold's weapons carefully assembled over 40 years, organized and labeled and ready for use. She could deploy them tomorrow and the legal challenge would evaporate. She could destroy Derek and Vivian and Connor with 3 manila folders and a willingness to go public. But doing so would make her something she had never been. It would mean using fear as a tool. It would mean weaponizing private information against people who, however cruel and entitled they might be, were still the children of the man she had loved. It would mean stepping across a line that Harold himself had never crossed, despite having the means and perhaps the motivation to do so. Harold had written that using the information would have been unethical, that he had been a better person than that. Had he? And was she? And more importantly, who did she want to become in this new chapter of a life that was suddenly terrifyingly, magnificently wide open? She closed the folder. She did not sleep that night. But by morning, sitting at the desk with the first light filtering through the forest and in through the leaded glass windows of the study, she had made her decision. She would give them one chance. She would respond to their legal challenge with documentation of her legitimate ownership, with the facts of the 1984 gift, with the legal structure that Harold and Marcus had built specifically to withstand exactly this kind of assault. She would present the truth and give them the opportunity to accept it and walk away. And if they refused, if they pushed, if they came for what Harold had spent 40 years protecting, then she would use everything he had left her, not because she wanted to, but because sometimes protecting what you love requires becoming someone you never imagined you could be. 3 days later, a private investigator appeared in Thornfield. Eleanor learned about him from Dorothy, who had spotted an unfamiliar man in a rental car asking questions at the gas station about property ownership and real estate values in the area. The investigator spent 2 days in town, approaching various residents with questions about the Thornfield property, about Harold Whitfield, about Eleanor. The town's response was unanimous, immediate, and absolute. Dorothy gave the investigator directions to a property that was 15 miles in the wrong direction. Pastor Brennan could not recall anyone named Harold Whitfield ever visiting Thornfield. Ruth Patterson had never heard the name. Sarah at the library had no records, no files, no information of any kind that might be helpful. The teenagers on the library steps told the investigator that the old house on Oakwood Lane had been abandoned for decades and was probably haunted and was definitely not worth the drive. An entire town closed ranks around Eleanor without being asked, without being organized, without any coordination beyond the simple shared understanding that one of their own was being threatened and that protecting her was not a choice but an obligation. It was the most powerful thing Eleanor had ever witnessed. Not power in the way that Harold's world defined it, Power is money and influence, and the ability to make people do what you want. But power is solidarity as community, as the collective decision of ordinary people to stand together against something they recognized as wrong. That evening, Eleanor sat in Harold's study and opened the folder labeled with his children's names. She read through the documentation slowly and carefully, absorbing every detail, understanding the full scope of what Harold had assembled. And then she closed the folder and placed it back in the filing cabinet and sat in the darkness for a long time, thinking about what she was willing to do and what she was willing to become, and where exactly the line was between protecting yourself and destroying someone else. She had not yet decided, but she knew the decision was coming. And she knew that when it arrived, she would make it not as the woman she had been for 40 years, the woman who swallowed her voice and avoided conflict and endured with grace, but as the woman she was becoming. The woman who lived in a sanctuary built from love and secrets and the accumulated evidence that she had always been worth fighting for. The Mercedes appeared on the dirt road on a Thursday afternoon in late October, 3 days after the private investigator had retreated from Thornfield with nothing. Eleanor was upstairs in the master bedroom, changing the sheets she had just washed and hung to dry on a line stretched between two oak trees, because she had discovered in the weeks since arriving at the sanctuary that she preferred the smell of sun and wind in clean linen to anything a machine could produce. It was a small preference, a tiny assertion of personal taste. But after 40 years of doing things the way Harold preferred them done, every small preference felt like a revolution. She heard the engine first. That particular low, confident growl of German automotive engineering, the sound of money moving through space, the acoustic signature of people who believe that the quality of their vehicle says something meaningful about the quality of their character. She went to the window and looked down through the canopy of oak leaves that were turning from green to gold to the deep burning red that makes New England autumns famous, and she watched the black Mercedes roll slowly up the dirt road, its polished paint and chrome trim looking absurd against the rough terrain like a tuxedo at a campfire. Derek was driving. Vivian sat in the passenger seat with the rigid posture of a woman who is accustomed to controlling every situation she enters and is suddenly uncertain whether this one will cooperate. Connor was in the back seat, leaning forward between the front seats, and all three of them were staring through the windshield at the house with expressions that Eleanor could read clearly even from the second floor. They had expected a ruin. They had come prepared to confront a desperate, broken woman in a falling-apart shack. A woman so grateful for any attention that she would sign whatever they put in front of her and disappear from their lives with the quiet efficiency that had always been her defining characteristic. Instead, they were looking at a two-story fieldstone house with a slate roof and leaded glass windows and carved wooden trim and ivy climbing the walls in patterns that suggested an English country estate rather than rural Massachusetts. They were looking at restored gardens where a fountain ran with clear water and roses still bloomed in organized beds, and stone pathways wound through grounds that were wild but undeniably expensively beautiful. They were looking at 247 acres of protected woodland that stretched in every direction as far as they could see. They were looking at a fortress. And from the expressions on their faces, they were beginning to realize that the woman inside it was not the woman they thought they knew. Eleanor watched them get out of the car. She watched Derek straighten his jacket and square his shoulders, assembling the persona of confident authority that he wore to business meetings and boardrooms. She watched Vivian check her reflection in the car window and adjust her hair with the quick practiced movements of a woman who never appears in public without full armor. She watched Connor pull out his phone and take several photographs of the house and grounds, probably already calculating property values, already translating beauty into numbers, already reducing this place to a line item in a spreadsheet. She watched all of this from above, from the second-floor window of a house that was legally, permanently, and unassailably hers. And she felt something settle in her chest like a keystone finding its place in an arch, the final piece that allows the structure to bear weight, the element that transforms a collection of individual stones into something that can stand for centuries. She did not rush downstairs. She finished making the bed. She smoothed the sun-dried sheets with her palms and adjusted the pillows and stepped back to look at the result with the satisfaction of a woman who has discovered that the simplest acts of creating order and beauty in her own space on her own terms for her own pleasure are more fulfilling than 40 years of creating order and beauty for someone else. She checked her reflection in the bedroom mirror. not to primp or preen or ensure that she looked acceptable by someone else's standards, but to look at herself, really look, to see the woman who was standing there, 68 years old, white hair, clear eyes, hands that had spent 4 decades serving other people and were now finally irrevocably free. She looked at this woman and she recognized her. Not the secretary, not the wife, not the stepmother or the hostess or the invisible woman in the second row, but the woman underneath all of those roles. The woman who had been waiting patiently and without complaint for 40 years to be allowed to exist. Then she walked downstairs at her own pace and opened the front door. "Hello, Derek. Vivian. Connor. Would you like to come in?" Her voice was calm, pleasant, unhurried. The voice of a woman welcoming guests into her own home, which was precisely what was happening, though the guests did not yet understand how thoroughly the power dynamics of this interaction had shifted. For 40 years, Eleanor had been a guest in their world, tolerated, at best invisible, at worst occupying space that they believed belonged to them by right of blood. Now they were guests in hers. And the rules were different here. They followed her inside and she gave them time. She did not rush to fill the silence with explanation or justification, or the anxious hospitality of a woman trying to make uncomfortable people comfortable. She simply let them on in the main room and absorb what they were seeing: the wide plank floors, the stone fireplace, the quality furniture, the leaded glass light, and the photographs. She watched their eyes move across the walls, across the dozens upon dozens of framed images, and she watched the slow, uncomfortable dawning recognition that every single photograph was of her, that their father had covered every wall of this house with images of the woman they had spent 40 years dismissing as nothing more than the secretary who had gotten lucky. She watched them begin to understand, and the understanding was clearly painful for them, delivered not as a single blow, but as a slow accumulation of evidence that could not be denied or explained away. Their father had loved this woman, not as a convenience, not as a companion, not as a provider of domestic services, but as the central, defining, most important emotional reality of his adult life. He had built this shrine not because he was sentimental or foolish, but because she was sacred to him in a way that his children, for all their claims of being his true legacy, had never been and would never be. Eleanor let the silence do its work. Then she gestured toward the living room with the same gracious composure that she had employed at 1,000 dinner parties, except that now, for the first time, she was not performing graciousness in service of someone else's social agenda. She was wielding it, like a weapon. "Please sit down. I will make tea." She served them in porcelain cups that had belonged to Harold's Uncle Thomas, the man who had left Harold this house in 1984 with a single instruction that Harold had honored for 40 years. She poured with hands that did not tremble. She offered sugar and cream with the unhurried courtesy of a woman who has all the time in the world and no need to prove anything to anyone. She realized with a flash of something that was not quite humor and not quite satisfaction, but contained elements of both performing the role of gracious hostess one final time. But this time, the performance was a choice rather than an obligation, and the audience was not a room full of people she needed to impress, but 3 people who needed to understand that they had lost. Derek spoke first because Derek always spoke first, because Derek believed that speaking first was the same as being in charge, which is a common mistake made by people who confuse volume with authority. "Eleanor, we have come to discuss the property situation. We believe there has been a misunderstanding about Father's will and the value of this property." "Really?" Eleanor took a sip of her tea with the deliberate slowness of someone savoring not just the beverage, but the moment. "What kind of misunderstanding?" Vivian leaned forward with the focused intensity that Eleanor recognized from decades of observation. It was the look Vivian wore when she was about to make a demand while framing it as a reasonable request, a skill she had honed through 3 marriages and 3 divorces and countless negotiations in which she had emerged with more than she entered. "Our father clearly did not understand the true value of this property when he left it to you. Now that we have done research and had professional assessments conducted, we realize this land and house are worth considerably more than anyone knew. As his children and his primary heirs, we believe we have a legal right to a share of all significant assets associated with his estate." "This property is not associated with his estate," Eleanor said. "It was deeded to me in 1984 as a personal gift, completely separate from our marriage, completely separate from any marital property. I have documentation going back 40 years to prove it. We do not believe that is legally binding, Connor said, and the fact that he was speaking at all told Eleanor how significant this moment was to all three of them, because Connor normally contributed nothing to any conversation unless money was directly involved. We think any gift of significant value given during a marriage should be considered joint property, subject to division. Then I suppose you will have to take me to court. Eleanor set her cup down. And I suppose your attorneys will have to explain to a judge why a gift deeded in 1984 structured specifically and deliberately to be separate from marital property, with 40 years of tax records and legal documentation supporting that structure, should suddenly be reclassified as a joint asset simply because you want it to be. There was a pause. The kind of pause that occurs in negotiations when one side realizes that the other side is not going to fold, that the assumptions they walked in with were wrong, that the power they believed they held is not as absolute as they thought. Vivian tried a different approach. She leaned back in her chair and arranged her features into an expression of patient reasonableness that Eleanor recognized immediately as theater, as performance, as the mask Vivian wore when she was about to issue a threat while maintaining plausible deniability. Eleanor, you should understand that we have unlimited legal resources at our disposal. We can extend this challenge for years. You are 68 years old. You are alone. You have no legal team, no financial reserves for a protracted court battle. Do you truly believe you can sustain a fight against us for as long as it takes? And there it was. The threat delivered with Vivian's trademark precision, aimed at every vulnerability Eleanor possessed. Age, isolation, limited resources. The mathematics of being old and alone against young and wealthy and organized. It was the same calculation that had governed Eleanor's life for 40 years. The assumption that she was weak, the certainty that she would bend. For one moment, Eleanor felt the old conditioning activate like a reflex. The voice that had governed her behavior for 4 decades whispered its familiar instructions. Give in, step back, avoid the confrontation. Be the gracious woman who smooths things over and keeps the peace and never ever forces anyone to deal with her anger or her pain or her refusal to be quiet. You have survived this long by making yourself small. Make yourself small again. It is safer. It is easier. It is what you know. She looked up at the wall above the fireplace. There was a photograph there larger than most of the others, hung in a position of prominence that suggested it held particular significance. It showed Eleanor in the Brookline garden on a summer afternoon. She was kneeling in the soil, her hands buried in the earth, her face turned slightly upward toward the sun. Her eyes were closed. Her lips were curved into a small private smile. She looked like a woman who had, for one brief, unguarded moment, forgotten to be anyone other than herself. Harold had taken this photograph without her knowledge. He had seen her in this moment of pure, unperformed happiness, and he had thought it was so beautiful that he had framed it and hung it in the most prominent position in his most private space. He had looked at this image probably hundreds of times over the years, during all those secret weekends, and he had seen in it something that Eleanor herself had forgotten was there. The woman beneath the wife, the person beneath the performance, the self that 40 years of accommodation and silence and good behavior had almost but not quite erased. He had seen her. For 40 years, when no one else was looking, Harold Whitfield had actually seen her. Eleanor looked away from the photograph and back at Vivian. She felt the old conditioning recede like a tide going out, pulling back from the shore it had covered for so long, revealing ground that had been hidden beneath the water. Solid ground. Her ground. She stood up. She walked to the study with the unhurried deliberation of a woman who knows exactly what she is doing and exactly why she is doing it and has made peace with both. She returned carrying the thick folder labeled with the names of Harold's 3 children. She placed it on the coffee table between the teacups with the careful precision of someone handling something that has the potential to cause great damage. Before you make your decision, she said, and her voice was the steadiest it had been in 40 years. There are some things you should know. She opened the folder wide enough for them to see the contents. Dense pages of documentation, dates and names and figures in Harold's meticulous handwriting. Tab dividers separating decades of carefully accumulated, carefully verified, carefully preserved information. This folder contains detailed documentation about the trust your father established for your inheritances, not the simple generous inheritances you believe you received. The actual trust with all their conditions and restrictions and requirements that you are going to discover very soon when you attempt to access your money. She paused, letting this information settle. It also contains documentation about various personal and business matters affecting all three of you, matters that you would strongly prefer remain private. She looked at Derek. Derek, there are documents here concerning certain business transactions of yours that would attract significant public and regulatory attention if they were to become known. She looked at Vivian. Vivian, your financial arrangements during your divorce proceedings were not entirely transparent. The documentation here would be of considerable interest to several people, including at least one of your former husbands and his legal team. She looked at Connor. Connor, your company has accounting irregularities that are documented in sufficient detail to support a formal investigation by tax authorities. The room had gone very quiet, the kind of quiet that exists in the space between a lightning flash and the thunder that follows when you know the sound is coming, but you do not yet know how loud it will be. Your father spent 40 years as one of the most prominent and well-connected attorneys in Boston. Eleanor continued. He documented everything he learned about everyone. That was his nature, meticulous, thorough, comprehensive. He never used this information during his lifetime because he considered doing so to be unethical, and in that particular regard, he was a man of principle. But he left all of it to me, along with the clear understanding that I should use it if I needed to protect myself and protect what he built for me. She closed the folder but left it on the table. Visible, present, a reminder of what it contained and what its contents could do. Here is my offer, and I want to be absolutely clear that this is the only offer I will ever make. Walk away. Accept the will exactly as it was written. Live your lives with your complicated trusts and your conditional inheritances and your historic mansion with its mortgage and its preservation requirements and its property taxes. Leave me alone in my sanctuary. We never need to see each other again. We never need to speak. We can spend the rest of our respective lives pretending that the others do not exist, and I suspect we will all be happier for it. She paused. But if you challenge me in court, if you attempt to take this property or any part of it, if you make my life difficult or uncomfortable or complicated in any way, I will release every single piece of information your father collected about you. Every transaction, every arrangement, every irregularity, every secret, your reputations, your social standing, your business relationships, your carefully maintained public images. All of it will be destroyed, completely, permanently. And there will be nothing you can do to undo it because the truth once released cannot be put back in its box. She looked at each of them in turn. Derek, whose face had gone the color of old ash. Vivian, whose composure had cracked along fault lines that no amount of Botox could conceal. Connor, whose phone sat forgotten in his pocket for perhaps the first time in years. Do you understand me? The silence that followed was the longest silence Eleanor had ever experienced. It was a silence so complete and so dense that it seemed to have physical weight pressing down on everyone in the room like a change in atmospheric pressure before a storm. The antique clock on the mantel ticked steadily, measuring seconds that felt like hours, each tick a small hammer, striking the surface of the silence and finding it unbreakable. Derek and Vivian and Connor looked at each other. They looked at Eleanor. And Eleanor could see it happening on their faces, the slow, uncomfortable, fundamentally unwelcome process of seeing someone clearly for the first time after 40 years of deliberate blindness. Not the secretary who had married their father, not the invisible woman who had served them dinner and packed their childhood bedrooms and swallowed their insults with a smile that cost more than they would ever know. Not the discarded wife collecting her pathetic severance, but a woman with power, real power, the kind that cannot be purchased or inherited or acquired through connections, but can only be earned by surviving things that should have destroyed you and emerging from the wreckage not just intact, but stronger and clearer and more dangerous than you were before. We will need to discuss this privately, Derek said. His voice had lost all its boardroom smoothness. It sounded like something being dragged over gravel. Of course, Eleanor said. Take all the time you need, but I want you to understand something before you go. This property is mine. It was always meant to be mine. Your father loved you in his complicated way. I believe that. But he loved me more. He just did not have the courage to show it publicly until after he was gone. And I think if you are honest with yourselves, you have always known that. That is why you resented me, not because I was unworthy of him, but because you knew somewhere deep down that I was the one he chose. Every day, for 40 years, he chose me. They left without another word. Eleanor stood on the porch and watched the Mercedes navigate the dirt road with the careful slownesses of a vehicle that has discovered it is out of its depth. It disappeared around the bend, the sound of its engine fading into the forest, until there was nothing left but the wind in the oaks and the water in the fountain, and the call of a bird she had not yet learned to identify, but that sang, she thought, with the particular sweetness of something celebrating the departure of an unwelcome guest. She went inside. She sat in Harold's chair by the window, and she cried. Not the tears of grief that she had shed in the parking garage after the will reading, not the tears of shock that she had shed when she first saw the photographs covering the walls of the sanctuary. These were different tears, cleaner, lighter. The tears of a woman who has been holding her breath for so long that she had forgotten she was doing it and who has now finally exhaled. They dropped the legal challenge within a week. Marcus Sheffield called to confirm. The will was settled, closed, finalized, done. No appeals, no further challenges. No more contact from Derek or Vivian or Connor, or their attorneys or their investigators, or anyone associated with them. It was over. The Brookline mansion took 9 months to sell. 9 months during which Derek and Vivian and Connor discovered the substantial mortgage that Harold had taken against the property. 9 months during which they navigated the historical preservation requirements that turned every potential sale into a gauntlet of committee reviews and environmental assessments and neighborhood approval hearings. 9 months during which the property taxes and maintenance costs drained their resources at a rate none of them had anticipated. When the house finally sold, the net proceeds after the mortgage, and the legal fees, and the realtor's commission, and the various costs that Harold had so carefully embedded in the property's ownership structure were dramatically less than the millions they had counted on the day the will was read. The trust restrictions proved exactly as challenging as Harold had designed them to be. Derek's first annual character evaluation, conducted by the legendarily inflexible Judge William Hoffman, resulted in a 6-month probationary period during which his access to trust funds was suspended, pending a review of certain business practices that the judge found, as he phrased it in his written determination, inconsistent with the ethical standards required by the trust's terms. Vivian's attempt to demonstrate stable family relationships was complicated by the fact that her third ex-husband had recently filed a motion to revisit their divorce settlement among, and 2 of her 3 children had publicly declined to participate in the evaluation process. Connor lasted exactly 14 days as the active personal manager of his investment trust before hiring a consultant to handle the daily operations, which triggered the automatic dissolution clause and resulted in the transfer of his entire inheritance to a consortium of charitable organizations that Harold had selected with what must have been considerable amusement, including several that focused on providing legal aid to elderly women in financial distress. Harold's revenge had been patient. It had been brilliant. It had been perfectly, absolutely, comprehensively legal. And it had been devastatingly, poetically, almost cosmically appropriate. Eleanor spent the months that followed transforming the sanctuary from Harold's shrine into her own home. Not by erasing what he had built, but by adding to it, by placing her own choices alongside his, by creating a conversation between the space as he had imagined it and the space as she wanted to live in it. She hired workers from town, young men and women who were glad for the employment and who approached the property with the respect that people in Thornfield naturally accorded to anything associated with Harold Whitfield's legacy. They cleared the stone pathways that had been partially reclaimed by grass and weeds. They repaired the fountain, replacing cracked mortar and corroded fittings, and when the water ran clear for the first time in years, rising from the center column and falling in a gentle cascade into the stone basin, Eleanor stood and watched it with the expression of a woman who is seeing not just water, but proof that broken things can work again. The gardens received her particular attention. She spent hours walking the overgrown beds, identifying what had survived and what had been lost, noting which roses were still healthy and which needed replacing, planning the additions she would make in the spring. She organized the kitchen garden into neat rows of herbs, The fragrant architecture of thyme and rosemary and sage and basil that she knew from 40 years of cooking and that connected this new home to the one she had left behind, not with nostalgia but with continuity. She updated the kitchen, installing a modern range alongside the antique wood stove, adding a dishwasher and improving the lighting while keeping the farmhouse sink and the copper pot racks and the open shelving that gave the room its character. She chose new art for the walls, paintings she found at antique shops in nearby towns, landscapes and still lifes and abstracts that she selected based solely on whether they pleased her eye, a criterion so simple and so revolutionary that she sometimes caught herself laughing at the novelty of it. She did not replace the photographs of herself. They were part of the house now, part of its story, part of the love that had built it. But she added her own images alongside them. Photographs of her parents, of the Brookline garden at its peak, of Thornfield in different seasons, of Dorothy and Pastor Brennan and Ruth Patterson and Sarah Caldwell, and the other people who were becoming slowly and genuinely her community. She filled the bookshelves with books she actually wanted to read, novels and memoirs and histories and poetry collections that she had been meaning to get to for decades but had never found time for because her time had always belonged to someone else. She arranged the furniture to suit her own comfort rather than the requirements of entertaining moving chairs closer to windows, adding reading lamps where she wanted them, claiming the space with the quiet authority of a woman who has discovered late in life that the simple act of arranging a room to please yourself is one of the purest forms of freedom. She volunteered at the library every Tuesday and Thursday, helping Sarah catalog new acquisitions and organize reading programs for children. She helped at the community center on Wednesdays, where she discovered a talent for organizing that surprised no one who knew her history, but delighted her nonetheless, because organizing events for a community that appreciated the effort was an entirely different experience from organizing events for a society that barely noticed. She attended the small white church every Sunday morning, sitting in the same pew, third row from the front, on the left side, and she was greeted each week by name by people who were genuinely, visibly, unmistakably glad she was there. Dorothy Pemberton became the closest friend Eleanor had ever had. They talked every day, sometimes briefly, when Eleanor stopped by the general store for supplies, sometimes for hours when Dorothy came to the sanctuary for dinner, or Eleanor walked into town for tea at Dorothy's kitchen table. They talked about everything and nothing about gardening and cooking and books and the small, daily dramas of a tiny town, and they also talked about the things that mattered most about loneliness and loss and the strange miracle of finding connection in places you never expected to look. For the first time in her adult life, Eleanor belonged somewhere. Not because she was useful or ornamental or necessary for the functioning of someone else's social machinery, but because she was herself. Because the people of Thornfield had come to know her not as Harold's wife or Derek's stepmother or the gracious hostess of the Brookline mansion, but as Eleanor. Just Eleanor. A woman who loved gardens and books and cooking and quiet mornings and the particular shade of gold that the oak leaves turned in late October. A woman who listened when people talked and remembered what they said and showed up when she said she would and never ever made anyone feel invisible. It was enough. It was, she discovered, with something like astonishment, more than enough. It was everything. Then on an ordinary afternoon in early spring, with the first crocuses pushing up through the soil outside the sanctuary's windows and the forest just beginning to show the pale green haze of new growth, Eleanor found it. She had been organizing papers in Harold's study, a task she had been undertaking gradually over several months, filing some documents, discarding others, slowly making the space her own, while preserving the organizational structure that Harold had built. She pulled open the bottom drawer of the desk, a deep drawer she had not fully explored, and found wedged behind a stack of old legal journals another envelope. It was sealed. It was labeled in Harold's handwriting, for Eleanor's future. Open when you are ready. Eleanor sat down in the desk chair and held the envelope in both hands and felt the weight of it and knew with the particular intuition that comes from having been surprised by this man so many times that surprise itself had become a form of expectation that whatever was inside would change things again. That Harold, even from beyond death, had one more act of love to perform. She opened it. Inside was a deed, a second property, 20 acres on the eastern edge of Thornfield, bordering the state forest, with a small red barn in good condition and a stone cottage that looked from the photograph attached to the deed like a smaller version of the sanctuary itself. The deed was in her name, had been in her name since 1992, 8 years after the sanctuary, another gift structured to be completely separate from their marriage, completely untouchable by anyone else, completely and permanently hers. There was also documentation of a trust fund, $500,000 established at a Boston bank in 2018, 6 years before Harold's death, designated specifically for whatever projects or purposes Eleanor Whitfield chooses to pursue in her new life. The language was Harold's precise and legal, but the intent behind it was something softer and larger and more generous than any legal document could fully contain. And there was a note, handwritten, brief, the last words Harold Whitfield would ever write to the woman he had loved for 40 years, from a distance he could never quite close. For your future, whatever you want it to be, build something, create something, transform something. This is your blank canvas. Paint it however makes you happy. You spent 40 years living my life. Now live yours. Eleanor read the note twice. She set it down on the desk beside the letter she had found on her first day in the sanctuary, the 5-page letter that had explained everything, and she looked at the two documents side by side. The long letter, desperate and apologetic, and detailed the letter of a man trying to justify 40 years of weakness. And this short note, clean and simple and forward-looking, the letter of a man who had finally stopped apologizing and started hoping. She smiled, not the careful, measured smile she had worn for 40 years, the smile that said, I am fine, everything is fine, please do not look too closely, but a real smile, the kind that comes from the inside and does not care what it looks like from the outside, the kind that exists not for an audience but for itself. She knew exactly what she wanted to do. She was going to create a retreat for women. Women who had spent their lives as she had, supporting other people's dreams and maintaining other people's homes and accommodating other people's needs and forgetting in the process that they had dreams and needs of their own. A place for widows who had lost not just their husbands, but the identity that being someone's wife had given them. For women leaving difficult marriages who needed not just physical shelter, but psychological space room, to breathe time to think, permission to figure out who they were when they were not defined by their relationship to someone else. For women who needed what Eleanor herself had needed when she drove down Oakwood Lane for the first time with 3 suitcases and 2 boxes and a rusted iron key and absolutely nothing else. A sanctuary. She would call it Whitfield House. Harold's last gift transformed from a private monument to one man's complicated love into a public resource for women who needed the thing that Eleanor had finally found. Not just safety, not just security, but the opportunity to discover, however late, whoever they actually were. She presented the idea to Dorothy first over tea at the kitchen table, and Dorothy's response was so immediate and so enthusiastic that Eleanor later wondered whether Dorothy had been waiting for exactly this idea the way Thornfield had been waiting for exactly this woman. Then she presented it to Pastor Brennan, who offered the church meeting hall for a community presentation and promised to connect her with regional support networks for women in transition. Then to Sarah, who proposed building a small library within the retreat because a woman finding herself needs books the way a plant finding sunlight needs water. Then to Ruth Patterson, who said simply, Harold would have loved this, and who offered to teach cooking classes because food made with love is medicine for the soul. Eleanor presented her vision to the entire town at a meeting in the small white church on a Tuesday evening in late April, standing at the front of the room before an audience of perhaps 60 people who had come not because they felt obligated, but because they wanted to hear what Eleanor Whitfield had to say. She spoke for 20 minutes without notes, without rehearsal, without the carefully constructed persona that she had worn for 40 years like a suit of armor. She spoke as herself, and the town responded not just with approval, but with participation, with offers of time and skill and resources, with the kind of collective enthusiasm that arises when a community recognizes that one of its members has proposed something that reflects their shared values and their shared understanding of what matters. The town that Harold had quietly, secretly nurtured for 40 years, the community he had built through anonymous donations and quiet generosity and monthly visits that his wife never knew about, rose up around Eleanor like a garden that had been waiting for the right season to bloom. And Eleanor, standing at the front of that small white church with tears on her face and a vision in her heart, and the absolute certainty that she had finally found the thing she had been looking for her entire life, understood something that Harold had known all along, but had never been brave enough to say out loud. That love is not a transaction. That devotion cannot be measured in dollars or square footage or the number of dinners served and compliments swallowed. That the most valuable things in life, the things that actually matter, the things that endure, cannot be inherited through a will or seized through a lawsuit or calculated on a spreadsheet. They can only be built slowly, carefully, with patience and generosity and the willingness to show up day after day, year after year for the people and places and purposes that make life worth living. Harold had built this all of it, not just the sanctuary, but the community around it, not just the trust funds, but the trust itself, the web of relationships and gratitude and genuine affection that now surrounded Eleanor like the roots of those ancient oak trees, invisible, but strong enough to hold the earth together. And now it was hers, not because she had inherited it, but because she had earned it, because she had walked through 40 years of invisibility and 7 weeks of devastation and emerged on the other side not bitter, but open, not broken, but ready. Not the woman she had been told to be, but the woman she had always been underneath. On an evening in late October, 1 year after she had first driven down Oakwood Lane, with nothing but 3 suitcases and a rusted key and a terror so complete she could barely breathe, Eleanor sat on the restored stone porch of the sanctuary and watched the sun set behind the ancient oaks. The air was cool and smelled of wood smoke from the fireplace she had lit that morning and fallen leaves and the last roses of the year, the ones that always bloom sweetest just before the frost takes them. The forest was a cathedral of color, red and gold and orange, and the deep, almost purple shade of brown that certain oak leaves turn at the very end of their season, holding on to the branch for one last day, one last hour before letting go and joining the carpet of color on the forest floor. The fountain was running. The gardens were put to bed for winter, mulched and pruned, and ready to sleep until spring woke them. Through the trees, she could see the first star of the evening appearing above the ridgeline, faint and tentative, the way all stars appear at first as though they are not quite sure they are welcome. Eleanor thought about the journey that had brought her here. She thought about the coffee cooling on the nightstand beside a man who would never drink it, about the second row at the funeral, about Marcus Sheffield's careful voice reading words that had reduced 40 years of love to a service contract, about the 30 days of watching her life be dismantled by people who had never valued it, about the rusty key in the dirt road and the cathedral of oaks and the door that had opened onto a room full of photographs of a woman she had almost forgotten how to be. She thought about Harold, complicated, flawed, brilliant, cowardly, devoted Harold who had loved her with an intensity he could not express and a patience he could barely sustain and a cleverness that was in the end the most honest thing about him. A man who had failed her every day for 40 years by being too weak to stand up to his children and who had redeemed himself after death by being too smart for them to beat. A man who had built her a fortress disguised as a forgotten house freedom, disguised as abandonment power, disguised as worthlessness, and who had trusted that she was strong enough to find her way here and wise enough to understand what he had really left her. Not just property, not just money, not just protection from people who wished her ill, but permission. Permission to stop being who everyone else needed her to be. Permission to start being who she actually was. Permission to discover at 68 years old that the woman she had been suppressing for 4 decades was not just still alive, but had been the whole time waiting, patiently, quietly, without complaint, the way Eleanor had always waited, for the moment when someone would finally see her and say, "Your turn now." Eleanor closed her eyes. She listened to the wind in the oaks, that ancient patient sound that has been the same for centuries and will be the same for centuries more. She listened to the water in the fountain, the gentle percussion of droplets falling into a stone basin. She listened to the distant sound of someone in town playing a fiddle on their porch, a melody she did not recognize. But that was beautiful in the way that music played for its own sake, without audience or purpose, is always beautiful. She felt for the first time in her life completely and entirely at peace. Not the peace of resignation, not the peace of exhaustion, not the peace of a woman who has given up wanting things because wanting has always led to disappointment, but the peace of alignment, the peace that comes when who you are and where you are and what you are doing all line up like the tumblers of a lock clicking into place, and the door that has been closed your entire life swings open, and beyond it is not the unknown, but the familiar. The self you have always been, the life you were always meant to live. She opened her eyes. The star above the ridgeline had been joined by others, and the sky was shifting from the deep blue of late dusk to the vast stars scattered black of a New England autumn night. Somewhere inside the house on the desk in Harold's study, two letters lay side by side, the long one and the short one, the apology and the permission, the explanation and the invitation. Forever and always yours, Harold. And somewhere on the eastern edge of town, on 20 acres of possibility, with a red barn and a stone cottage, and a trust fund, and a future as wide and as open as the sky above the forest, a blank canvas waited for Eleanor, Ann Whitfield, to decide what she wanted to paint. She had decided. She was going to paint everything. Eleanor Ann Whitfield was 68 years old. She had spent 4 decades being exactly who everyone else needed her to be. The efficient secretary, the accommodating wife, the invisible stepmother, the gracious hostess, the woman who never raised her voice or took up too much space or asked for anything for herself. She had been so good at disappearing that she had almost disappeared entirely, had almost forgotten that there was a woman beneath all those roles, a self beneath all that service, a human being with her own dreams and preferences and desires buried under 40 years of someone else's. But here in this sanctuary built from stone and secrets, in the stubborn, imperfect, complicated, enduring love of a man who had not been brave enough to save her publicly, but had been clever enough to save her privately, surrounded by forest, that had stood for centuries and would stand for centuries more, surrounded by a community that had claimed her as one of its own, surrounded by the infinite, terrifying, exhilarating possibility of a future she would design entirely for herself. Eleanor, or Ann Whitfield, was free. Free to be loud, free to be difficult, free to take up space, free to plant whatever she wanted and watch it grow without asking anyone's permission, free to make mistakes and change her mind and try again, free to discover that 68 was not the end of anything, but the beginning of everything. And she was discovering with a joy that surprised her every single morning, when she opened her eyes and remembered where she was, that beginning was exactly the right word for it. The sun was gone. The stars were out. The wind moved through the ancient oaks with a sound like breathing, like the forest itself was alive and awake, and watching over the woman on the porch with the same patient, protective devotion that had built this place and maintained it and hidden it, and at exactly the right moment revealed it. Eleanor smiled into the darkness. She was not afraid of it. She had lived in darkness for 40 years, the comfortable, well-furnished, socially acceptable darkness of a life lived entirely for someone else, and she had survived it. She had walked through it and come out the other side and found waiting for her in the light a house full of photographs that proved she had been loved, and a community that proved she was valued, and a future that proved she was far, far from finished. She stood up from the porch chair. She stretched. She looked up at the stars one more time, all of them visible now, the whole vast sweep of the autumn sky spread above her like a promise written in light. And she went inside to make herself a cup of tea and sit by the fire and read a book she had chosen for no reason, other than that she wanted to read it. And that was enough. That was, she had finally learned everything.